Okay. So happy Tuesday, happy offer practice day. Um, we have, I tried to do something a little bit different this time. I don't know if either one of you have had the opportunity to participate in yesterday's contract training with Joan and Steph. I personally didn't get to watch it yet, but they were supposed to be talking about, the home sale contingency, a bump clause, and then a secondary offer contingency. So I thought I would try to weave some of that into this offer practice today. So you'll see where that might, that training might come in extra handy, but we can just get into it. So we've got our property here on Joyce Avenue in Milwaukee. And if I open it up, it's a cute little 3-bed, 2.5 bath home in the city of Milwaukee. Let's see, take a quick look to see if there's anything that we need to know in private remarks, because that's usually one of the first places that I go to. And it looks like all kitchen appliances are included, square foot estimated, room sizes and dimensions not verified. That's pretty typical. We can see here what our inclusions and exclusions are. You'll note one of the inclusions is the lawnmower, which that's very exciting. But I don't know if you guys can see, if I open up the condition report, can you guys see what's on my screen, the condition report?
Yeah. we can
Perfect.
read it.
Okay. So this is something too that I take a quick look at, especially if I can get to it before I even schedule the showing. I always like to try to understand what's going on with the property. So if there is anything flagged in the condition report, and I can take a look or spend a couple extra minutes when I'm at the showing, just exploring and learning a little bit more. So it looks like this condition report is pretty squeaky clean from what it looks like. Other than, are you aware of any federal, state, or local regulations or corrections of an existing condition? They put yes, I'm not quite sure. That would be something that I would call the listing agent on, because if they had a yes marked on any of the items above, they should be including here in the blank lines why that question or why that comment was marked yes, but they don't have anything. Maybe it was a mistake, who knows? So that's the scoop. This was signed back on April 23rd. So let's just get right into some of our offer assumptions. So today we're helping Christian Yelich. He's going to be our buyer. He signed a buyer agency with us last week, agreeing to 2.4% compensation, and that agreement is valid for 3 months or 90 days. He has a closing time frame. He can't move before June 13th or can't close before June 13th. So June 13th or after is okay. He's pre-approved for up to 375, and he's going to be putting 10% down, and then a 6.7% mortgage rate is what we can kind of use right now for the financing piece. So let's make some assumptions that we all can use then to craft our offer. We are going to pretend that another offer has already been accepted, a primary offer, and that the sellers are willing to entertain secondary offers. Do you guys kind of know why a seller would want to do that?
For like safety.
Yeah, maybe. Usually, usually you see sellers entertain secondaries in 2 occasions. One might be right after they accepted a primary offer. Maybe there was another offer that was so close to that one that they accepted, they kind of want to see if the buyer would be willing to submit then as a secondary and have them waiting in the wings. The other time typically falls within that inspection contingency. So if a seller feels like the first offer that they've accepted might be heading south, or it might feel like it's going to be falling through, a good listing agent is also going to be consulting with their sellers to see if we could get a secondary offer signed and accepted and waiting in the event that primary one falls through, then that secondary offer can become primary if the seller so choose. So it really is like a safety or protection thing. And it gives the sellers a little bit of extra comfort knowing too, that if something happens, there is potentially another offer that can slide from secondary into primary position. Make sense?
Yes, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So let's say I am a listing agent, right? And I get one offer that's just a tiny bit better, but they're super similar.
Yeah.
And then I want to accept the secondary offer. Do I write to how do I tell the buyer to like make it a secondary offer?
Sure. So first and foremost, you have to accept a primary offer.
Okay.
Okay. So first, accept the offer that your sellers really want to be primary. Then what you can do is you, the listing agent, could counter that other buyer's offer by indicating that they would be a secondary offer. You could ask the buyer's agent to write the counter instead of you, to include the secondary offer contingency, or they could just submit a brand new offer too and have that contingency marked if they want to, right? Like I would probably pick up, if I was listing agent, I would pick up the phone and call the buyer's agent for the secondary buyers and just say, here's the deal. We've accepted another offer. However, would you be interested in becoming secondary? And there's a couple, three different ways we could do this. We could send you a counter if you want. You could send us a counter, or you could just send a brand new one. But good question. Okay, let's keep going here.
Thank you.
Yeah, for our offer, the seller's asking for 24 hours for binding acceptance. The seller wants to close as soon as possible, and they are willing to cover the buyer's agent's compensation, just put it into the offer, 2.4% is fine. So here's our instructions for this offer. We're gonna offer $330,000. The asking price right now is 325. And again, this isn't competitive offer practice. It's just offer practice, but we'll just offer 330. For our inclusions, we're going to want the fridge, stove, microwave, and dishwasher. We don't want that lawnmower. Let's just pretend. We're just trying to get into the habit of making sure we are paying attention to details as it pertains to some of the items that are included and excluded. So for our exclusions, seller's personal property as well as that lawnmower. We're going to close on June 13th. Christian's going to give 1% in earnest money. And if anybody was on the team meeting today, I think Charlie might have mentioned April's accepted offers. They were coming in at roughly 1.6% of the purchase price would go towards earnest money. So we typically see earnest money between like 1 to 3%, but really your buyers can offer whatever they choose. For our contingencies, we're going to have a home inspection, radon inspection. Christian's getting a loan, so we're going to include that. I probably should have put it in here too, an appraisal contingency, which we'll do. But he's writing as a secondary offer. So that's going to be the thing that we're going to focus on today in terms of some of the differences about this week's offer versus offers we've done in the past. And then the seller is willing to cover the buyer's agent's commission. So we're going to write that in as a contingency as well. So when I go into zip forms, I've got one already created. So we'll just get started. So we've put our date here, May 13th, and because Christian signed a buyer agency agreement with us, that makes him our client, and we are his agent and his agent only. So we are the agent of the buyer. So I've kept that open, and I have crossed out agent of seller and listing firm, and then agent of buyer and seller. I put his name here on line 3, and then I've put the address of the property on line 4. And line 6 reads that 9073 North Joyce Avenue is in the city of Milwaukee. So in line 6 is where you'd have to put the municipality type, which could be city, village, town. I don't know what any other ones might be off the top of my head. And then you put the city that the home is being taxed by. And if you don't know, you can just go back to MLS. Here at the top, it'll tell you the county. But also towards the middle of the listing information, you'll also see it lists the municipality type as well. So if you don't know, refer back to MLS. We're offering $330,000, so I just have to type that in on line 10, and then Zip Forms will automatically populate the price on line 9 then to match. And here are our inclusions. So again, our buyer wants the fridge, stove, microwave, and dishwasher. What our buyer doesn't want, so an exclusion, so this stuff better not be at the home when we go through our final walkthrough, is the seller's personal property and then the lawnmower. So always just make sure you double check and you ask your buyers. Review the list of inclusions and exclusions that are on MLS, but just make sure you review them with your buyers as well to see what in fact they do want to include and not include in the offer. This section here lists all of the fixtures that might be on the property. So anything that might be affixed would stay. So make sure you familiarize yourself with those items. And we're going to ask for binding acceptance. They needed 24 hours. We're going to pretend we're sending in our offer today. So we'll give them through the whole day tomorrow, May 14th. If you wanted to put in a specific time, like 3 p.m. tomorrow, you could just type in 3 p.m. On that date. Otherwise, if you don't put a specific time, the deadline or the time frame goes through 11:59 p.m. on the date that you are putting here on line 40. And that holds true for any of the other dates that are included within your offer as well. We are having our closing on June 13th. At least that's what our buyer wants. And hopefully that should be fast enough for the seller because they said that they wanted to close as soon as possible. And my Zip Forms automatically includes this language here on line 48. So closing is going to take place on June 13th at the place selected by the buyer. So then I have to cross this section off at the end of that sentence because then it would contradict the first half of the sentence. And that's very typical for the buyer and their lender to kind of figure out where closing is going to be. Moving down then into the second page, just make sure your address carries through to the top of the subsequent pages. So, and sometimes Zip Forms doesn't carry it through from the first page over to the second page and thereafter. So if it's not correct, all you have to do is click in the line and then update it accordingly. But our first section here at the top of page 2 is earnest money. And we know that Christian, our buyer, was going to be offering 1% of the purchase price in earnest money. So I've put that amount here, $3,300. And I've just put here that we're going to have that delivered within 4 days. You know, the sooner the better in my mind. But just make sure that you tell your buyers that if your offer is accepted, that earnest money will need to be delivered. That's usually the first thing that gets done by the buyer, but that money will be taken and will be withdrawn from whatever account the buyer is using. So if they need to move some money around to ensure that it's in the correct account, that's their time to do it. But I've just checked 4 days here. If you don't put anything, you leave that line blank, it's going to be 5 days. And all earnest money shall be delivered to and held by, I have the listing firm here, not the drafting firm and not other identified as. So I've crossed those out. If you aren't sure who's holding the earnest money, it's okay to ask the listing agent. A lot of times the listing firm is the firm that holds the earnest money, but there are some situations where it might be a smaller brokerage or maybe just the preference of the listing agent that they want to get a title company involved to hold the listing or to hold the earnest money. So it's okay to ask the questions, and some listing agents will even include that in private remarks within MLS. So you have that information as well. This section here talks about what happens to the earnest money if the offer falls through. So I'm going to actually, it's a very important section, but I'm going to skip it. So make sure you just read through it. If you have any questions, by all means, ask a PC coach, ask the Pumble channel, ask your compliance broker. But for timing purposes today, we're gonna keep going. The next section here is the condition report, and the state requires any sellers to provide a condition report and fill that out to the best of their knowledge. There are some situations where a seller does not have to fill out the condition report. One of those might be in a situation where it's being sold by a trust and a personal representative for the trust is responsible for the sale, and that representative has never lived in the house, so they really don't know. But our situation here on Joyce Avenue, we do have a condition report, and the seller provided that, and it was filled out and signed back on April 23rd. So we've got to make sure we put the date that the condition report was filled out here on line 107. And this just indicates that your buyer acknowledges that a condition report has been provided. Moving on to page 3, make sure again, you just double check your property address has carried through to the top of the page. But a lot of times there's really nothing that you have to do here on page 3. This is just examples of things that would and should be disclosed within a condition report by the seller. So just familiarize yourself with that language. And then moving on to page 4, our first contingency here is the home inspection. So I've checked the box in line 193 indicating that, yes, our offer is contingent upon the seller or the buyer having a home inspection. And there's some definitions up here as to what's different between an inspection and a test. An inspection is really just the visible inspection of the property. When you have a test, that actually takes something from the property to like a lab to have it analyzed. So the inspection contingency is just a visual inspection that must be done by a licensed and registered home inspector with the state of Wisconsin. It can't be someone's like grandpa. That might be handy, unless the grandpa is a licensed home inspector. So I've checked the box here. If my offer was not contingent on a home inspection and we were waiving the home inspection, rather than leaving this box blank, I would put NA for not applicable. But I've checked the box here because our buyer, Christian, does in fact want to have the home inspection. If we wanted to write any specific inspections and include those in the offer right away, an example might be a basement inspection or a chimney inspection. Rather than wait for our home inspector to recommend those follow-up inspections, if you and your buyer thinks something might be fishy or something really needs to be looked at as it pertains to a specific area of the home, you can write those in as well here. It gives your buyer some extra protection. It might not be as attractive of an offer to a seller, but if that's what's important to your buyer, then include it. But this section here also indicates that the buyers can have a follow-up inspection if the home inspector recommended it. Doesn't mean that they have to have it, but this gives us the opportunity to say, if the home inspector went through and he noticed there was some issues with the roof, the home inspector put in his report, have a follow-up inspection done by a roofing company. This gives us the opportunity to do so. We don't have to ask permission. Now, we want to have our home inspection contingency. You want to give yourself enough time to get this done and to have any follow-ups and any negotiations complete. But you also want to make sure you're trying to be advantageous and a little bit fast on this too, because this typically is the most stressful time of a home or of an offer and of the whole transaction process. So you want to give yourself enough time to have all the necessary inspections and get all the necessary information. But on the flip side, a shorter home inspection contingency time frame does look more attractive to a seller. So I've put 9 days here. I typically put like 9 to like 12. And sometimes I can get it done a lot faster. But what this date means is that you're going to have the home inspection. You're going to have any follow-up inspections that the inspector recommended that your buyer wants. And you're gonna be negotiating if there's things that your buyer, wants the seller to replace or to fix or to credit them on or to adjust the purchase price. These are all things that you've got to get done within 9 days. And let's say we'll use the roof as the example here. Say the roofer comes in and says you need to replace, it's a complete tear off, $15,000. And say your buyer is willing to take on the roof repair after closing, but they want a credit or they want a purchase price reduction. I would call the listing agent and say, here's what's going on. We try to negotiate. Let's say both parties agree this for the seller to give a purchase price reduction of $15,000. We make that formal and final when an amendment is drafted and both parties sign the amendment. We have to do all of this within 9 days. This cannot just be, you have 9 days to have the home inspection. This all has to happen within this time frame. So let's say within those 9 days, we can't come to an agreement and an amendment has not been signed by both parties. And your buyers are really thinking like, you know what? We can't take this on ourselves without help from the sellers with a price reduction. If they're really not willing to work with us, then we will have to issue a notice of defect. And that needs to happen, if not on day 9, maybe like day 8. You don't want to wait. So when we get to this section then of the offer, and there's additional trainings on home inspection contingencies that I always like to send to you guys after this, so you have them. Because I don't want to spend too much more time on this, but everything is written here in the offer when it comes to what happens next if you can't come to an agreement and a notice of defect is delivered. In our market right now, it's very common to give the seller the right to cure. And the right to cure could be fixing it, crediting it, adjusting the purchase price, whatever. So if the seller shall have the right to cure the defects, if they do have the right to cure, the seller can satisfy the contingency by delivering a notice back to the buyer within, I put 2 days after the buyer sent them the original notice. To me, waiting and giving more time than this, it shouldn't be necessary if the lines of communication between the two sides have been open throughout that 9-day contingency period. So again, the seller can satisfy the contingency by giving a notice back to the buyer saying they're going to satisfy the contingency, that they're going to cure the defects in a good and workmanlike manner. And then they're also going to send to the buyer a written report no later than 3 days prior to closing that shows all the work that was done. Now, the offer is null and void if the buyer sends that notice of defect along with the inspection report and the seller never had the right to cure to begin with. So that's where your buyer really has the upper hand and has the opportunity to pretty much kill the deal upon inspection. But the offer can also be null and void if the seller had the right to cure, but the seller delivers a notice back saying, I'm not going to do anything. Or the seller sends a notice back saying they're going to cure, but they didn't deliver it back within these 2 days, so they were late. So everything written in this section, a lot of your answers are going to be right here in terms of like, well, what happens next? And a lot of this language carries through then to the next contingency, which is radon. And we know our buyer wants to have a radon test. So we've checked that box. And typically the radon test time frame here is the same as the home inspection. A lot of home inspectors can do the radon test now, along with the inspection. They drop a kit in the basement and it stays there for 48 hours, taking various levels throughout the day of any potential radon. And then the home inspector goes back, picks it up, and then you get a report. If the report comes back and the radon is at a level higher than 4.0, of whatever unit of measure this is. I don't remember what it is. It's like picocuries. Then this cure language is pretty similar to what you just saw then in the home inspection. So if the seller shall have the right to cure, again, very customary in our market right now, and the seller can satisfy it by sending a notice back saying they're going to cure it. And usually the cure is having a radon mitigation and system installed. All of that should be done within 3 days prior to closing. And it has to also then be tested again to ensure the levels are back under 4.0. But the offer is null and void if that buyer delivered a notice to the seller and the seller never had the right to cure to begin with, or the offer is null and void if the seller delivered a notice back saying, I'm not going to cure it, or the seller delivers a notice back, but it was delayed. So just make sure, again, familiarize yourself with this language, and you'll be light years ahead of some of your fellow agents. So I'm going to move into financing. Our buyer is getting a loan with a lender, and Christian's getting a 30-year conventional loan. So that's the loan type that I put in here in line 249. If your buyer was getting a 15-year loan, an FHA loan, a VA loan, that's where you would put the loan type. And we are going to deliver our loan commitment within, I put 21 days. We're closing in about 30 days. And I always like to have, or at least our proposed closing date is within about 30 days. I like to give myself maybe like a week between financing and closing, just so we all have a little bit of a buffer or a cushion. We can take a sigh of relief once everything is satisfied. But if you aren't quite sure how fast your lender can get a loan commitment together with the buyers, it's okay to pick up the phone and call the lender and just walk him or her through what you're thinking for timing. But 21 days is pretty common right now. Then in line 251, this is actually the amount of money that the loan is going to be for. So I've taken the purchase price, which we're offering $330,000, and I've subtracted his 10% down payment. So I've got $297,000, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm doing my math right. So I'm going to open up my mortgage calculator, and I think that should be right. Then here on line 251, we have to put the number of years that the loan's going to be for. So I put 30, and our loan's going to be amortized over 30 years as well. So those two numbers match. And then the initial monthly payments of principal and interest for just the loan only, I have here is $1,916.48. So I got this amount by plugging into my mortgage calculator. Our property our offer price of $330,000, our down payment of 10%, and I've used that 6.7% interest rate that I had put on the offer assumptions. I plugged that into my calculator, and this is what I have for the monthly mortgage payment. So again, this is just principal and interest. Make sure your buyer also realizes that there might be additional things that they will have to pay for that get rolled into their monthly amount. And that could be taxes, home insurance, PMI. So this just represents what their loan is going to be for. And when I come down here, I have to indicate what type of loan financing they're going to be getting. And we're getting a fixed rate, meaning the same interest rate is going to be charged throughout the duration of the loan across 30 years. So I've put the interest rate shall not exceed 6.7. If you don't know what interest rate to put, but please call the lender and just ask for a little bit of confidence and insight into what he or she would think would be a good rate to put into the offer. The next section here talks about how to satisfy the financing contingency, what happens if the buyer doesn't get a loan commitment. So please make sure you read this section. Line 288, seller financing, I've put NA. This is not going to be included or a part of our offer. This would be if the seller was helping the buyer with financing. It might be assumable mortgage, it might be a loan, I don't know, but we're not worrying about that today. So I put NA. If your buyer was getting, purchasing the home with cash and it was a cash offer, then we wouldn't have filled in all of that information for the financing section. And instead we'd be indicating, when we would be delivering a proof of funds to the seller, showing that this buyer has the money on hand to purchase the house. So that's when we would be filling in this section, but we're not, because we're getting a loan. And then here on box 308, we are going to be including an appraisal contingency. So this checking the box on that line doesn't mean we're going to have an appraisal done. What this box does, or what this section does, is brings a little bit more specificity around what could happen and how will things get resolved if the home appraises for less than what the buyer is purchasing it for. So usually I have my contingency due a couple of days before financing. This appraisal is actually, it influences whether or not your buyer will actually get the loan. Sometimes, so that's why I have it due a couple of days before. Some agents put the same number of days for the appraisal as the loan commitment, but I always just kind of stagger them a little bit. In our market, it's once again very customary to give the seller the right to cure. And really the right to cure when it comes to the appraisal contingency is giving the seller the opportunity to reduce the purchase price in the event the appraised value comes in low. So we'll use an example. We're buying this house or we're offering $330,000. Well, maybe the appraised value comes in at $320,000. And so we've got a $10,000 gap. There's a good likelihood that your buyer's lender won't be able or won't give your buyer the loan commitment because the appraised value is coming in low and the lender doesn't think the house is worth what you're offering. So there's that $10,000 gap. Your buyer can go back to the seller and ask them to reduce to the purchase price shown on the appraisal report. So that's what this says here. Seller shall have the right to cure. If seller has the right to cure, they can satisfy the contingency by delivering a notice to the buyer adjusting to the purchase price shown on the appraisal report. And I said within 2 days after the buyer gives the appraisal report over. So something to note, when you are working with a buyer and if they are getting an appraisal done, typically the lender sends the appraisal report to the buyers, not because they're the lender's client. If your appraised value comes in at the purchase price or above the purchase price, you should not send that appraisal report over to the listing agent. The only time you send that appraisal report over is when the appraised value is lower than the purchase price, because the seller needs to see proof and verification that it did in fact come in low. So if it came in, let's say at $320,000, we send over the appraisal report so they can see it. And then we also send over a notice objecting to that. And we have to do that within 2 days. Seller and buyer agree. So once the seller says, yes, okay, I will adjust the purchase price to $320,000, then both parties have to sign an amendment that officially changes the purchase price, which is all stated right here. The offer is null and void if the buyer makes timely delivery of that notice objecting to the value and sends that written appraisal report. And the deal is dead if the seller never had the right to cure to begin with, and your buyers don't have the money to make up the difference. Or it's also dead if the seller had the right to cure, but the seller comes back and says, nope, I don't want to. Or the seller doesn't send a notice back within those 2 days. So again, a lot of this language looks very similar to some of the other contingencies. I'm going to skip through these two sections, the home sale contingency and the bump clause. We're not going to be including those with our offer. Our buyer does not need to sell his current home in order to buy this house, so we're going to skip past those. But I am going to spend a little bit of time here on the secondary offer. So as we stated it, or as we talked about at the beginning of the training session, we are pretending that the seller accepted another offer, and that offer is in the primary position. However, the seller was willing to entertain secondary offers. So meaning having some offers waiting in the wings in the event the primary falls through. Something to note is that a seller can accept multiple secondary offers. I repeat, they can accept multiple secondary offers. So they might have one primary offer already accepted, and they could have 3 secondary offers. So just because you're secondary doesn't mean you're in second position. They could be accepting multiple secondaries. So let's read what this section includes. This offer is secondary to a prior accepted offer, which is a primary offer. This offer shall become primary upon delivery of a written notice to the buyer that this offer is primary. Okay, so again, let's say we're writing as a secondary offer and the seller accepts our secondary offer. Well, we become primary when the first offer has officially fallen through. And we become primary when the seller sends us a notice telling us that we become primary. Now, again, there's everything you could ever want to know and more about this contingency is right here in black and white. Unless otherwise provided, the seller is not obligated to give the buyer a notice prior to any deadline, nor is any particular secondary buyer given the right to be made primary buyer or primary ahead of other secondary buyers. So again, there could be multiple secondary offers. The seller can choose which one that they want to bump into the official primary position. Now, something that's interesting and I think actually helps a buyer, because you don't want, say you get this secondary offer accepted, you don't want to have, your buyer can't write another offer. Unless they plan on buying 2 houses and they can finance 2 houses or they have the cash to buy 2 houses. But if you get this secondary offer accepted, your buyer should not be writing any other offers on any other houses until this one officially is either put into primary, or really you shouldn't be doing anything until this one dies. So the buyer, though, has a way to get out. The buyer can declare the offer null and void by sending a notice indicating that they're withdrawing this offer to the seller. And they have to do that before the seller delivers a notice to the buyer saying, hey, you moved into primary position. So again, a buyer can get out of this offer altogether as long as they get out before the seller puts them in primary position. And there's a time frame to this too. So it says the buyer may not deliver that notice of withdrawal earlier than 5 days. I put 5 days after acceptance, meaning we get our offer accepted today. We are not allowed to actually withdraw this offer for 5 days. The longer you've got in this line here, the more days means the more tied up your buyer is going to be in this deal. The fewer days means the fewer days. Like you can get out of this sooner, as long as the seller has not already put you into the primary position. So a lot of times, like if you don't put anything in here, it's 7 days. So your buyer has to wait 7 days before they can withdraw. If your buyer is really interested in a few different homes and you're kind of waiting to see what's going on with this one, maybe you don't put 5 days, maybe you put 2 days. I don't know. But just make sure you read how this all works. It's right here in this section. Then all offer deadlines, say our offer moves from secondary into primary, all of the deadlines that we had put in our offer, they all start from the time the offer becomes primary. Hope that makes sense. Okay, I'm continuing to move down. Okay, now we've got to figure out, okay, how are things going to be prorated between the two parties, buyer and seller, when it comes to things like taxes, special assessments, what have you? And most likely you're going to be checking this box here in line 366, meaning that we're going to take a look at what the taxes were from the previous year, and we're going to prorate them between the two parties. Note, if it's new construction, there's a strong likelihood that the taxable amount from the year before might not have been the amount indicative of having a house on the property. It might have just been taxed for vacant land. So if you're not quite sure what box to check here in one of these options, by all means, call the helpline, call your compliance broker, and they can help coach you to what would be the best option for your buyers. But just note, you don't have to figure out any of these amounts of money. You just have to give the title company and the lender direction as to how it's going to be divvied up. Then moving in, here we've got a section here on title, what title is, who pays for the title. So make sure that you review that and understand what's going on. Here's a bunch of just definitions that they've thrown in. But I'm going to stop here on maintenance. So make sure that you let your buyers know that the seller is responsible for keeping the property in the same condition that the buyer saw it on the day the offer was written. The only thing that could change is any like ordinary or normal wear and tear. But if there is some damage to the property, and here's in this section here, starting on line 468, if there's some damage to the property and that damage is less than 5% of the purchase price, the seller has to notify the buyer what happened, and then the seller has to restore and fix the issue and bring the property back to the same condition that it was as of the date of the offer. If the damage exceeds 5% of the purchase price, then we have a situation where a seller still has to notify the buyer, and the buyer has the opportunity to actually get out of the offer if they want. So something just to keep in mind. Here, buyers have the opportunity to have a final walkthrough within 3 days prior to closing. So that's something that they are able to do. This section here talks about default, what happens if one of the parties is at defaults on one of the contingencies. Remember, you are not a lawyer. You cannot give legal advice. If you're in a situation where it might appear that that is the next step, you could refer your clients to a lawyer. And then I'm just going to scroll down to here. Our last contingency on the offer is line 543. So we're checking the box and we're asking the seller to pay the buyer's firm's compensation. So I've put 2.4% of the purchase price here in line 544. And then what is in here in these blank lines is just some information that I got out of the clause library over here. So if any date, a deadline falls on a holiday or a weekend, it gets bumped to the next business day. The only time that happens is, or doesn't happen, is binding acceptance. Binding acceptance can happen any day of the year. And then I've just added some language here as well from the clause library. If you just click on this, clauses, there's all these pre-written clauses that our lawyer has given us the thumbs up to use. I just add some language here around if the seller has the right to cure, they have to use a professional and things have to be done in a good and workmanlike manner. I'm checking the box here on line 587. We're going to be delivering information via email. The email address for the seller is actually the listing agent's email. And the email address for the buyer is your email address, the buyer's agent. And then for this offer, the only addenda we're going to be including is the GMAR addenda A. I've put my name here, my brokerage as to who drafted the offer, and that's the offer. I'm going to quickly then just go into our GMAR addendum A. The only thing that is going to be filled out on addendum A in this example or in this offer, we've got our date, our name, our address. The only thing, everything is NA. The only thing that we're filling out on addendum A is that we have a lead paint addendum. It's addendum S. And then I filled in my information here as the buyer's information, and then the listing agent's information here for the sellers. I know I went through that fast. I'll just open it up to anybody who might have questions. Oh, 1 minute. Sorry, somebody's trying to get into the room I'm in. Hold on, I'm pausing with questions. Okay, I'm back. Does anybody have any questions?
Are all the forms on that zip form or transaction website?
Yes. So have you gone through zip form training yet?
I have not.
have not.
I'm trying to even log in and it's not letting me.
Oh, okay, you just have to log in. Okay, you still have to do that. I will send you a separate email with a link to a zip form training that we have.
Okay.
All of the documents we will automatically be populated based on the type of transaction that you select you're going to be working with. So if you're going to have buyers and you're writing an offer, you have to just select that you're writing an offer, and then all the necessary documents will populate. The same thing holds for listings. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Can I just ask a quick question about the lead-based paint thing? Why
Yeah.
we selected that? I think it said the house was built in 1979. Why
Yeah.
would we include that?
Very good. We probably didn't need to.
Okay.
Now, there are some brokerages that will actually, regardless of the age of the home, will have their sellers fill out a lead-based paint. I think Shore West does that a lot. But that's a good catch, Caroline. We probably didn't need to do it.
Okay. Thank you.
Nice, nice. Way to pay attention. Okay. I will send you guys some follow-up links later this afternoon with some of those extra trainings, but hope you take advantage of offer practice and send me your offer by tomorrow at 1. Thanks, everybody.